discussion. I'll talk a bit about what has maybe motivated the Saudi policy decision to not only reach an agreement to restore relations with Iran, but also to choose China as the vehicle with which to make that final push. We've seen obviously several rounds, at least 5 rounds of dialogue between Saudi Arabia and Iran over the last 2+ years. So this agreement didn't come out of thin air, but of course its timing and the location of its announcement did come as something of a surprise. Now, Saudi policy towards Iran has been obviously gone through times of strain, but also through periods of rapprochement. And one of the more interesting things for me for the trilateral statement from March the 10th that was released in Beijing was the reference to the previous agreement signed by Saudi Arabia and Iran in 1998, an economic agreement, and a security cooperation agreement in 2001. Now, of course, those agreements then gave way to a period of intensified regional competition, partly, perhaps largely resulting from the aftermath and the fallout from the US-led invasion of Iraq, which we just marked the 20th anniversary of. And bilateral relations obviously became tense in and after 2011 when Saudi Arabia and Bahrain tried to deflect away from some of the root causes of some of the unrest, especially in Bahrain during the Arab Spring, and effectively tried to push the blame for the unrest on meddling from Iran and other regional states. In 2016, we saw the trigger for the cutting of ties, which this agreement now seeks to restore, which was the aftermath of the execution of Nimr al-Nimr, the Saudi Shia cleric, and 48 other people, many of whom were Sunni radicals from a Saudi perspective, and of course the storming of Saudi diplomatic compounds as a result. Now, from 2015 up until about 2018, Saudi policy towards Iran, or at least Saudi rhetoric towards Iran, was much more hawkish, much more assertive. We saw Mohammed bin Salman giving statements such as, "We will make sure that any fight with Iran takes place in Iran itself." And we saw obviously the Saudi-led intervention in Yemen in 2015, the same week that P5+1 negotiators were meeting in Vienna to finalize what became the JCPOA. Effectively, we saw the Saudis and the UAE signaling to the Obama administration that they didn't think that you could just contain negotiations with Iran to one file only, the nuclear file. From their point of view, Iran's destabilizing regional activities and support for groups around the Middle East was something that they, the Saudis and the UAE, were going to take on themselves. Now, clearly the war in Yemen hasn't gone the way that had been hoped. It has been a sobering lesson in the limitations of the ability to project power and force, especially outside their borders. But what really was a game changer, which led, I think, to the whole process of changing mentalities in Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states, was the maximum pressure campaign launched by the Trump administration in 2018, after it withdrew from the JCPOA, and Iran's response, which led to a series of maritime and energy hits on Saudi Arabia and the UAE between May and September 2019. And most shockingly, from Riyadh's perspective, the attack on Abqaiq and Al Qudais on Saudi oil infrastructure in September 2019, which temporarily knocked out almost half of Saudi Arabia's oil production. In 2006, there had been a similar attack, but that was almost analog compared to the scale of the 2019 attack. 2006 attack where a suicide truck ramming the gates and blowing itself up. This one were missile and drone strikes which evaded defenses, caused absolute pinprick damage in terms of accuracy, and really put the Saudis on notice that they could be targeted anywhere, anytime, and the UAE as well. And I think what was also more shocking was that 2 days later, Donald Trump said this was an attack on Saudi Arabia. It wasn't an attack on us, signaling to the Saudis and to the UAE that he was drawing a distinction between US interests and their interests. And I think the assumption had been, especially when it came to anything to do with Iran, that those interests were one and the same. And we saw almost straight away Saudi and Emirati policy becoming much more, well, changing almost overnight. Both Saudis and the UAE separately reached out to Iran, the UAE directly, the Saudis to intermediaries in Iraq, but to de-escalate and diffuse points of tension. Now they no longer had or felt confident about full US support and backing no matter what. And this was fully evident in 2020 in January when Qasem Soleimani was killed, when the Saudis even sent Khalid bin Salman, the Deputy Defense Minister, to Washington to make the case in person to the Trump administration for de-escalation. Because you saw the Saudis suddenly realizing perhaps that they had to adopt a set of policies that reflected their own interests rather than their interests with the US supporting them regardless. And so we've seen much more, perhaps a realism in Saudi policy, at least in terms of having to find a way of coexisting with Iran. So it's within that framework that the 2 years of on-off negotiations have to be seen. And of course, the decision now to come to the agreement. And then finally, the final point I'll make is that Mohammed bin Salman announced Vision 2030 in 2016 in April, so almost exactly 7 years ago. There are now 7 years left of Vision 2030 until 2030, which has become this almost totemic year for Saudi Arabia. It's become the year that Mohammed bin Salman has defined as his sort of imprint. And he needs a period of stability. He needs time now to focus on implementing the giga projects, implementing all the transformational changes he's trying to make, and having missiles and drones raining down on Saudi cities and infrastructure is not something that will help in the optics and also in the implementation of those phases. Last week we had the Jeddah Grand Prix in Formula One. It went off without a hitch, but he will remember that last year the Jeddah Grand Prix was overshadowed by Houthi drones slamming into fuel depots a couple of miles away from the race, creating terrible optics, which didn't exactly give the international investor community reassurance that Saudi Arabia is a stable place to live, work, and do business. And so, from Mohammed bin Salman's point of view, he needs now to focus on domestic issues to deliver Vision 2030 as it gets into its implementation phase. And so, anything from his perspective that can dial down tension and give him that space domestically, I think, is what has driven this agreement to get over the line. So, with that, I'll pass back to you, Dan, and thanks.
Thanks, Tristan. That was a terrific summary of the events that propelled Saudi Arabia to engage in this diplomacy. And I think the underlying message there, or thesis, is that takes place in the context of perception of the declining power or influence of the United States. And I think that's really an important observation. Dina, we'll turn the mic over to you now.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for having me amongst such great guests. It's an honor to be here. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Iran's perspective to follow on from Christian. And basically, as Christian outlined, the Iranians and the Saudis had been talking for 2 years before they came to this agreement. So Iran's desire to de-escalate with Saudi Arabia, it's kind of been around for a while. This administration, the President Raisi's administration, made it clear when he first came to power that focusing on the region was going to be a priority. But the previous administration of President Rouhani had also done the same. So it's something that Iran sought out. It just, I think, wasn't ready or willing really to make the compromises necessary to get there, obviously until a few weeks ago. So today, why today? Why did they finally settle on this right now? I think there is an international dimension to it, and there's a domestic dimension to it. The international dimension, it's simple. Iran is finding itself in a slightly difficult position, to put it mildly. It's increasingly isolated. It had a taste of what it would be like if it, right after the JCPOA, the nuclear deal in 2015, what it would be like if it was a little bit more integrated into the community of states, basically. And then that was taken away from it under President Trump. And so today it's feeling the isolation, and it basically is trying to put in place layers of security against further future isolation. It's doing that by building relations with a whole range of states, including big powers like Russia and China. But de-escalation with its neighbors is also one thing that it's trying to achieve. And so this is the context in which this deal kind of emerged, basically. And it allows Iran to turn around to the West, to the US and its allies, and say, look, ultimately, you're never going to be able to isolate me in the way that you did prior to the nuclear deal. That's not going to work anymore. So that's on the international front. On the domestic front, there's a couple of reasons for it. I think one of the main ones is that we are firmly in the era of preparation for succession. And by succession, I mean whoever is going to come next to replace the current supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. The Iranian system has been preparing for it for a while. And part of that preparation is to ensure a certain level of de-escalation on Iran's foreign policy front. So it releases some bandwidth for the system to deal with what is going to be a pretty complicated time for the Islamic Republic. At a time where Iran is undergoing domestic discontent, which has been broadcasted around the world for the last few months, it's also a distraction. It's an injection, a small injection of hope. After all, the Saudis are seen, and they are, as being a pretty wealthy nation. And immediately after the deal, I think it was the Saudi finance minister that came out and said, we're ready to invest in Iran almost immediately. And that kind of thing it really does inject hope inside Iran. It's important. So there's definitely an economic imperative at a time where Iran economically is really struggling. So my reading is that they're clearly motivated. They have been wanting this for a while. And so I think they're going to try to implement it as much as they possibly can. But the question is, what did they promise as part of this deal, right? This is the thing that everybody's been speculating on. I think it's clear that Yemen is, something that featured as part of the discussions. It seems like the Iranian compromise could have been twofold. The first was that they may have made some kind of promise that they could do whatever they could to convince the Houthis to not start up cross-border attacks into Saudi Arabia. That poses a problem in itself, because we all know that Iranian control over the Houthis is not complete. So an Iranian promise to do what it can is just that. It will do what it can, but that doesn't mean that the Houthis are going to listen. The second thing that we've been hearing is that Iran may have promised to cease weapons transfers to the Houthis. I'm not going to lie, I was pretty surprised and skeptical when I first saw that. But then I guess if you think about it, there have been more seizures of weapons over the course of the last couple of weeks, months. And so you could fathom that maybe Iran upped the shipments in order to allow it to make a promise to seize the shipments. And it's not like there's a shortfall of weapons inside Yemen anyway. So it could be something that the Iranians promised. I was also asked to quickly talk about the potential impacts on Iran's policies in the region, if there are any. And on that, I'm a little bit more pessimistic. I'm cautiously optimistic about the deal, but on the impact on Iran's activities in the region, less so. Basically because if it's to have any impact at all, this deal would have to be implemented successfully without any hiccups, without anybody going back on the promises that they made. And that in itself is a massive if. And then you're talking about areas. So for example, Lebanon, key security concern for Iran, Hezbollah, the jewel in the Iranian crown, and not an area, not a country that's particularly important to Saudi Arabia. Saudi doesn't really know what it wants with Lebanon. So there's not much room there for compromise. And in fact, we heard literally 2 days before the Iran-Saudi deal announced, Hezbollah came out and announced that their candidate for the vacant presidency seat was probably the least compromising candidate they could have selected. So, kind of shows that it's not exactly, they're not really willing to make any compromises there. Syria, you could argue this deal will help normalization between Assad and the Saudis. But to be fair, normalization between the Gulf Arab states and Assad was happening way before this deal was announced anyway. So maybe the deal will help, but it's definitely not what prompted it. So I think that broadly, there is scope for Iran and Saudi Arabia to increase their communication, to diminish their tensions in the region if this deal is implemented properly. But it really remains to be seen what kind of impact that will have on the ground in the areas that both countries are involved in. I'll stop there.
Well, thanks very much. That was very helpful, and it certainly underlines I think the perception of Iran's leaders that if they're not in the driver's seat, they're certainly in a strong position. So that has implications for their willingness to make concessions on many fronts. We are now going to turn to Danya for her remarks. Thank you very much. You have the floor, the mic.
Thank you, Daniel, for having me, and cute cat back there.
Thank you very much. She appreciates it.
So I'm going to talk about great power competition pertaining to the US and China in the Gulf region. So there has been much fervor over China's brokered agreement for the restoration of diplomatic relations between Saudi and Iran. And it has been framed on many accounts as part of an upset of geopolitical realignment of the Middle East. And indeed, the international system is evolving and multipolarity is a reality, but it does not mean that the fundamentals of US-Saudi relations are changed. The reestablishment of diplomatic ties doesn't make Iran and Saudi Arabia suddenly friends, and nor does it make China eclipse the US's role in the region. I mean, Riyadh and Tehran, they still have clashing interests across the Middle East. And Dina, she even talks about like broader opportunities of de-escalation, and I could agree with her perspectives also. And I don't think the agreement has really addressed thus far key areas of divergence. And we're kind of in this wait and see moment. So don't get me wrong, it has potential to reap great benefit for de-escalation, but hasn't yet proven it. Now when it comes to hedging versus realignment, I think nuance is very important. In some analyses, I've noticed that there has been a conflation of hedging and shifting alliances. Certainly, Saudi Arabia and other GCC states have been looking eastward and increasing relations with China. But still, when it comes to great power competition, the security architecture of the GCC states is still highly dependent on the US. So in the current multipolar international system, especially after the onset of the Ukraine war, there has been more room for Saudi Arabia and the GCC states to maneuver through strategic hedging. But that does not necessarily mean realignment has occurred. However, the rise of multipolarity has not affected all areas equally. This is especially the case when it comes to regional security. Now, the fact that the Gulf is the backbone of the US security architecture in the Middle East, and the US will really remain the primary security guarantor for years to come. I mean, there's still an extensive basing structure there with permanent architectures. In Saudi Arabia, there's still over 2,500 US military personnel. It is true, for example, that the Biden administration has ended its support for the Saudi-led coalition's offensive military operations against the Houthis, but the US still continues to provide defensive support. And the supposed decrease of the US role has been a strategy for quite some time. One salient trend that stands out when reviewing the changes in US priorities as it pertains to the Gulf, when you look at the national military strategy, or the national security strategy or the national defense strategy is that the US approach has been really similar over the last decade. Since the early 2000s, under Obama, under Trump, under President Biden, the US's policy has been to invest in more resources, more sustainable resource approaches to security in the Gulf. There has been a push for states to work, for the US to work with states in partnership through agreements, joint force enablers, training, and advising. And this approach is actually called by the generals here in the US as the by, with, and through approach, and it's been in talks for quite a while. And I would argue that the US's deep-rooted influence in the Gulf remains quite strong. I mean, it's evident even when we see leadership changes in Washington. We saw how a change from Trump to Biden has really caused like a good amount of repositioning of regional actors. Granted, the Arab Spring era kind of ended, and the global pandemic also were major factors in shifting the geopolitics of the Gulf. However, I mean, the switch went from zero-sum maximalist geopolitics to a general mood of de-escalation, and this happened shortly after Biden took office. So it does show that policy choices of the US, whether to act or not to act, has a great influence on the strategic calculus of Saudi Arabia and the GCC states. It's worthwhile to note that the Biden administration reignited the fears in Riyadh and in other GCC capitals as well, that yet another Obama doctrine was underway. Another round of the JCPOA talks that does not consider the grievances of GCC states appeared looming just recently, I guess. And in the context, Saudi Arabia would have diminished negotiation leverage with Iran to reestablish relations after a JCPOA agreement. So now that the JCPOA talks pretty much failed, it was really the most opportune time for Saudi Arabia to enter into a negotiated agreement with Iran, because Iran is currently sanctioned and pushed into a corner. Whereas if the JCPOA was reinstated, then Saudi Arabia would have had less leverage with a more emboldened Iran. And I would argue that the US also wins from Saudi-Iranian detente. Saudi having diplomatic relations with Iran does not really conflict with US interest. Sure, we can concede that it does hurt the US ego a little, the way it was brokered through China, but the Biden administration has really praised the dialogue. And in fact, when you read the national security strategy, a pillar of US policy in the region is de-escalation and integration in the Middle East. And we all know Saudi-Iran tensions is a bottleneck issue for de-escalation in the Middle East. And it just seems like it does fit squarely into US policy interests, although it does bruise the US ego. So still, I believe that China remains, now in reference to China, it remains vital for strategic hedging. China is a crucial part of Saudi Arabia's overall strategic hedging. Beijing is a vital economic partner. Everyone knows that there's strong financial, economic, and I guess you could call some political interdependencies between both nations. It is well-known fact that China is dependent on energy, and as Christian noted, that Mohammed bin Salman is eager to successfully achieve his 2030 vision. But beyond energy security and economic relations, China does help diversifying arms procurements and helps Saudi Arabia acquire ballistic missile technology. And that is probably arguably to strengthen Saudi's deterrence capabilities against Iran. So Gary Sick, if anyone's in Gary Sick's group, said something very interesting that made me think a little bit. And he posed this question: has China lost its political virginity? Well, I I would say it kind of was lost a long time ago if you look back in history. During the 1950s and 1960s, China sought, as an ally of the Soviet Union, to confront the capitalist camp of the Western world, while simultaneously seeking to draw allies into the socialist camp. And during this time, China supported the Popular Front for the liberation of occupied Arabian Gulf, which was a Marxist movement that was supported by Yemen and focused on Oman. And China's attempt to export shows that China attempted to export its ideology in the Gulf. So the mediation, now coming back to the current events, the mediation role appears to be really, from my perspective, a gift from Saudi Arabia to China. It fits precisely into China's South-South policy, pan-Asian policy, and its economic interest to secure access to fossil fuels. De-escalation means less disruptions in fossil fuels and less price volatility. I don't know if I said that. It is a symbolic snub at the US at a minimal political cost. And so the question remains as to whether Sino-Gulf relations will evolve into more concrete strategic relations or really merely emphasize on commercial relations. Will China reemerge as a political player in the Gulf? And I say reemerge. And to what extent? When or if China crosses that threshold, we have to see if it's willing to assert itself and forcefully engage in moments of high tensions rather than ones of convenience during periods of regional reconciliation. That's when we should be concerned about it eclipsing the US strategic presence in the Gulf. Thank you.
Thank you, Danya. I think you put your finger on a number of really important issues, not least of which is the fact that everybody's hedging, including China, of course, and also that the wider China's role becomes in the region or any other region, the more complex the contradictions are for China. And I might say something about that in a minute or two as well. We are going to turn now to my comrade Imad, but before we do so, I'm going to remind everybody that you could submit questions at events@arabcenterdc.org, and I'll be paying attention to those questions as they come in. Again, events@arabcenterdc.org. Imad, you're next.
Thank you, Dan. Appreciate it. Thanks for chairing the panel. I really liked your paper. This is a plug for Dan's paper we published yesterday. It's really quite a tour de force, so to speak, regarding the U.S., Iran, the nuclear deal, a whole bunch of things, and China. I thank you, Danya, for really. I will dovetail a little bit with your remarks, but I do agree with what you had to say. It's really quite good. I just differ a little bit on the issue of strategic hedging. Is everybody strategically hedging, or just some are? But at any rate, we're talking here about a China that is emerging. Yes, long. What did that song go like? Long whatever, something about my friends. Those were long days when China really supported movements like that in the Gulf. Chinese communism today is almost like a title for reactionary politics worldwide. But at any rate, when we're talking about China and what China is trying to do in the Middle East with Saudi Arabia and Iran and others, China is defending its interests. It's trying to support its own interests, economic and political and strategic. And it has its own reasons, obviously, specifically today with Chinese President Xi Jinping winning a third term. He's out there, wants to make China a world power again, And he said so, by the way, and when he was leaving Moscow, when he visited President Putin just last week. China has to do what it's trying to do in the Middle East, obviously, because it, Iran and Saudi Arabia supply it of a considerable amount of energy resources that it really needs. The Chinese economy is not doing so well, slower GDP growth, fertility rate that is alarming for the future, potential issues of what do we do with basically hundreds of thousands of new employees looking for jobs, especially that the Chinese economy is dependent on the health of the international economy as well, and all those countries that import things from China are experiencing slowdowns themselves. But Saudi Arabia, as far as I'm concerned, Saudi Arabia is using the China thing. Yes, they want to sell oil. Obviously, they do. That's their most important commodity. They are basically strategically hedging because the United States has not, since the Obama administration, actually before even the Obama administration, the United States has not been ready to provide that security umbrella that the Saudis have been looking for. So they think that maybe we can go elsewhere. Although I really doubt that China is ready to provide that strategic, that security umbrella that the Saudis are looking for. The idea is, can China really replace the United States and the Saudi strategic understanding of their interests? From economic point of view, yes, China really needs their oil, but it has to do something that is reasonable, that is smart, and that is really doable. China is hoping that it will have a better situation in the Middle East, more influence. Yes, but can it really go the full way? Can it really provide what in general is an idea for can it be a hegemon? Can it be a hegemonic power? The United States tried it. The United States expansionist capitalist system to the point of imperialism is now failing at being the hegemonic power in the world, and in the Middle East it's doubtful. So I wonder if China is really able to provide that. For the Iranians, I think they're just simply desperately trying to counterbalance that influence that the United States has in the Middle East, or that the United States might potentially have going forward. Iran, as far as I'm concerned, is not hedging. Iran is bandwagoning because it thinks that China may provide some sort of a challenge for the United States internationally and in the region, which is true. Problem is, the Iran and China. Iran has the friendships with Russia, with North Korea, Venezuela, some countries of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and some others in the Middle East. But yet, still, I don't know how much China can really provide for Iran. As far we're not talking about economic issues. Obviously, Iran wants the economic investments. It wants assurance. The Chinese and the Iranians signed I don't know how many billions of dollars for over 25 years of investments in the economy. So this is a great deal, but I don't know how much, strategically speaking, militarily speaking, the Iranians can really count on the Chinese to come to their aid if there were anything to happen. We can look at the Chinese influence and role and what China is trying to do in the Middle East through there are a lot of questions that surround this. I wrote some down. Is China willing and ready to stop being the free rider that it has so far been in international politics? being a free rider is easy. You be a free rider. Somebody else provides the international security that's required on the high seas and international peace and security and all that stuff. Is China ready to do that? I mean, this is a very, very powerful kind of role that if it wants to play it, it's very, very important. Can China be the global power that can afford providing that security paradigm that imperialist the United States has been able to provide over the last few decades? Does China want to be an imperialist power? Maybe President Xi Jinping is willing to do that, but is it ready for that? I really doubt that it is. Can China ignore the bad challenges that it has in its own backyard? I mean, we're talking about Japan, South Korea, the AUKUS Security Alliance of the United States, Great Britain, and Australia. Can it really leave there to come to the Middle East? I don't get that. Is China's power fungible? We're not talking about the economic issues. We're talking about other political pressure issues. Can China's power be used, translated to be to resolve some really bad situations in the Middle East? I doubt it. We're talking about, can China really be friends with both, with all, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Israel at the same time? How does it put all these actors together? How does it work with them all together? If Saudi Arabia were to join the Abraham Accords, will Iran really like that? And will China's bet on the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran be a good bet? Can China really exert the leverage and influence that the United States has dismally not been able to influence in some really very, very important issues in the Middle East, such as resolving the Palestinian question? Is China ready for, in other areas, is China ready for the retail politics that it takes to really deal with something called the Yemen war or the Syrian war? It's the little small details of Lebanese politics. As Dan put in his paper, and I plug it again, it's very good paper.
Getting embarrassing there, Imad.
Can China really translate? Can China do what it did with Iran and Saudi Arabia? Can it do it for Iran's nuclear program? In other words, can it really produce on the stalled negotiations over the nuclear program today? So these are very, very important questions that are extremely important for China's role. This is obviously not to discount the importance of what China has done between Iran and Saudi Arabia. It's very welcome. It's really quite good, and the region needs it. But I really don't see it being much more than just simply an agreement between two neighbors who are supposed to be good neighbors after all. Thank you.
Thanks, Imad. Great questions, by the way. What you call imperialism, the Chinese call anti-hegemonic. That's the term they prefer to use, by the way. But I do recall, I think it was years ago, I was visiting the new Israeli foreign ministry in Jerusalem, and I think somebody told me that the Chinese had actually built the entire structure. So they're heavily invested in the region, and they're certainly heavily invested in Haifa, right? And so they have this extraordinary, projection of economic power. And I think what you're saying is that the heavy wears the crown, right? The more powerful they become, the more these contradictions or potential contradictions come out. So it's quite interesting. All right, Barbara, you're next, and you're going to be our last speaker, but I'm sure you have much to say, and there is still much to be said, by the way. So we're looking forward to hearing from you, and then questions are already coming in, so keep them coming, and then we'll move into a discussion. Go ahead, Barbara.
All right, Dan, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. Thanks to the Arab Center. What is left to talk about? Everybody has covered so much, but Look, I think that the economic aspects of China's relationships with all of these countries is really crucial, and that China has been amassing massive soft power while the United States has been making a number of mistakes in the region that I think have turned a lot of countries off. It was in about 2010 that China became Iran's main trading partner. This was during the first bout of multilateral sanctions against Iran because of its nuclear program. And China supplanted the European Union as Iran's main trading partner. A decade after that, China became the main trading partner for the GCC. We have fossil fuel producers who are shoring up ties with their biggest importer at a time when the rest of the world is certainly trying to wean itself off oil and gas. And so this may be a kind of temporary phenomenon, but for the next couple of decades, China is going to be buying most of the oil that's coming out of the Persian Gulf. And so this is kind of natural that China would step into a kind of mediating role in addition to its economic role. I think we also have to look at the impact of economic sanctions on Iran, certainly, but on other countries, and a desire on the part of Middle Eastern countries to build stronger relations with China, which has shown that it's willing to bust sanctions, to buy Iranian oil, even though there are secondary sanctions on it since the US withdrew from the JCPOA. We also have to remember that China has an agenda. Xi Jinping has made it very clear that he is looking to take Taiwan at some point, which means that China may join the so-called coalition of the sanctioned with Iran and with Russia. And I'm looking to see whether these agreements that are being brokered are going to have another aspect to them. And that is the question of de-dollarization. Will we begin to see more and more countries selling oil and getting yuan in return? The Saudis have not gone that far, but they have hinted at it at various times. That, of course, would be an enormous blow to the United States and would be an enormous blow to the role of the dollar in terms of the international economy. So far, no, but it's certainly something that I think we have to watch. What else will the Chinese do in terms of mediation? The Russians actually have now picked up the slack on the mediation between the Saudis and the Syrians. In case anyone hadn't noticed, there were talks in Moscow, and of course, it was mentioned that this trend of rehabilitation of the Assad regime predates this agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, but it's part of a sense that this look east strategy on the part of Iran, on the part of other countries, also includes Russia. Just yesterday, of course, the Saudis announced that they were going to join, I believe, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So you can call it, I think, as Danya did, hedging and not yet realignment. But something is shifting in the Middle East. There is a kind of turn, and where there is economic power, where there are economic relationships, other relationships may follow. So I think that this is a serious moment for U.S. policy. It's more than just egg on the face of the United States when it comes to watching, a rival superpower broker an agreement. There are trend lines here that should be concerning, frankly. I would advocate that it means the United States has to rethink its approaches, particularly toward the use of economic sanctions, which I think are backfiring more and more, that we have to make sure that we maintain ties with not only the countries in the region, but also with the Chinese, that we make sure that we are not putting ourselves in a situation where we are no longer capable of brokering agreements among adversaries. I don't know if you've noticed, but at Davos and also at the Munich Security Conference, the Russians weren't there, the Iranians weren't there. What are we doing in the West in terms of limiting our own ability now to moderate and mediate between adversaries in various conflicts? Bears watching. So I think those are the major points that I wanted to raise. I would also point out a very nice piece that we have up today on the by Giorgio Caffiero. Many of you know him, on the Syria rehabilitation and on the Russian role in bringing the Saudis and the Syrians back together. Russia and China are showing that they can walk and chew gum at the same time. And it's not enough for us to simply say, well, these countries are bad actors, the Russians are bad actors. No, they have the ability, because of their diplomatic relations with all parties in the Middle East, unlike the United States, to broker deals. And we need to pay attention to that. That's a very important soft power.
Well, thank you very much. Barbara, I think that what you said reminded me, I mean, my sense of it is there's almost kind of a hysteria here in Washington about Chinese power, which has a kind of momentum of its own that is quite remarkable. It's just a kind of, who's leading a return to the Cold War here. And of course, the Chinese are not helping. Where are they buying oil right now? From Russia. And there's some tensions already in the Gulf countries about China's purchase of Russian oil. There were some, loud complaints in the last few months. You heard that. Well, understandable. It's quite a remarkable shift in terms of, but of course, that purchase of oil is helping to sustain Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the massacres and so China is, on the one hand, there is a kind of hysteria about China going on here, but on the other hand, China is not being a very responsible actor, to say the least, in Ukraine. And this is a country whose leading premise in the international community is the sovereignty of nations and the rejection of the use of force, which is what the Chinese leaders are always talking about. Yet in the case of Ukraine, they are funding the Russian war, and there is some concern now that they may be supplying drones. So here it is. These are the deep contradictions between China's sort of impulse to be this anti-hegemonic power standing up to the United States, projecting power and so on the one hand, and being part of an alliance of global autocracies on the one hand, and then the equally important impulse to invest globally in the international political economy and be a source of investment in Israel and the Gulf and everywhere else, and the Belt and Road Initiative, all this. So there's these two very dramatic sort of contending impulses. It reminds me of what Kissinger used to say about Iran, which is, is Iran going to be a cause, or is it going to be a state? I mean, you could say that about a lot of countries, right, including the United States, I suppose. But this sort of tension in China's foreign policy is quite remarkable. And China's number one leader, as it were, seems to be much more erring on the side of sort of repeating his ideological premises and talking about creating steel walls with the Chinese military and all the rest of it. So that doesn't help move away from a Cold War perspective, does it? And that feeds the perception here in the United States that that's where we're heading. And so the dynamic between these two players, and then you think about the implications for Taiwan. So it's very disconcerting. I think, Barbara, you put it right, and a number of others said so, Nimad, is that what will China do about sort of, now the JCPOA is finished, right? It looks pretty dead. I mean, we're getting ready to bury it, and then but it looks pretty much now that the coffin is being, prepared. And what's the alternative? And what does Iran do? I mean, look, Iran is 85% enrichment right now. I mean, they're talking about the enriched uranium being enough for maybe 2 or 3 bombs. This is a dynamic that is moving along in the context of China's effort to sort of push regional peacemaking. And as Iman said, where's this big, here's the elephant in the room, where's this going? And does China have the capacity at all to affect any of these dynamics? I mean, I think it's an enormously important a question that's going to come up very soon, and in ways perhaps that will not be could be quite dangerous. So I'll put that out there because we're talking about and given particularly what's going on in Israel, the political struggles, the rise of the extreme right, or whatever you want to call it. The Abraham Accords, where are they going? Well, of course, the UAE is looking at what's going on in Israel and asking some important questions about this new government. So I think, it's, the regional architecture of peace, or whatever we want to call it, is far from firm. And I think China will get sucked into that question as we go along. So that's just, my perspective. So there are a lot of great questions here. Let's start with the first one, which is how, and anybody who wishes to jump into this, please do. How do we evaluate the reaction of the public in the region to the Chinese deal, both about the deal and the role of China? That applies as much, of course, to Iran as it does to, and there's been quite a lively discussion in Iran about sort of relations with Russia and China that's still ongoing. We forget how open these discussions often are, these debates. I bet there's a similar discussion in the Gulf region, and of course in Israel, if folks are not completely absorbed with the ongoing political struggles there. This issue, certainly the Israelis were quite shocked and dismayed because they felt, well, what does this mean for our accords? So anybody who wants to jump into that and provide us sort of a perspective, Dina, maybe you want to say something about sort of where, how do the of course, the Iranian public is not monolithic, nor is even the elite. So any insights on that would be welcome.
Sure, happy to. I think broadly, and this is not just applicable for Iran, but I would argue, maybe putting Israel aside, the rest of the region, or certainly the Gulf region, I think broadly the reaction has been pretty positive, both vis-a-vis the deal itself, the potential for reconciliation, and actually, interestingly, vis-a-vis China's involvement in the deal. In Iran, Iran's suspicions of China and of Russia, they're long-standing. They've been around for ages. One of the reasons Iran pursued the JCPOA to begin with was because it didn't want to be bound to Russia and China. It wanted to open up to the West. When that failed, I think it became a bit of a gloomy, dawning realization on the Iranian elite that actually Russia and China were going to be the only game in town, really, if they wanted to get themselves out of isolation. And that's kind of the context in which people view this deal. Iranians don't feel particularly warmly towards the Chinese. They don't like Chinese products. They don't have good experiences with Chinese medicine. Again, all of that is part of the reason why they pursued the JCPOA. But they're also incredibly pragmatic. China was around when everybody else ditched Iran and walked away from it. And that today is pretty important. And actually the same could be said for Russia, which is why you're seeing the rapid rapprochement with Moscow as well. So I think where they would have been very suspicious, very wary of Chinese involvement before, I think some of that has dampened a little bit recently. And in terms of de-escalation with the Saudis, again, I think they broadly welcome it. I mentioned that small potential injection of hope at a time where things are pretty grim inside Iran. I think that counts for something, not much, but it does count for something. And the prospect that Iran is looking for ways, or that the government is looking for ways to get itself out of isolation, to build relationships, to boost trade, to focus a little bit on the economy at a time where the economy has been shattered for years. I think that's welcome, given everything that's going on. And generally the Iranians, again, these are broad generalizations, but generally the Iranian public right now is very much focused on domestic dynamics and the discontent and what's happening inside the country. So the more you can diminish tensions outside the country. The reasoning is the more the government can focus on fixing things inside the country if they're in a position to fix anything at all.
Great, thank you very much. It's I mean, I recall that the Iranian president had said quite loudly their disappointment thus far with China's investments and so on, and that was articulated before. So that's against that background of that very loud and direct complaint. But now there's an opportunity perhaps for both sides to pursue this. So that's just. And Christian, do you want to say something about sort of Gulf perceptions, elite, popular about this development, either in Saudi or beyond, wherever?
Yeah, thanks. Well, again, the agreement, or at least the deal to put in motion a sequencing of events, seems to have been at least welcomed in media. Sometimes perhaps hard to read genuinely popular or public opinion, in part because in Saudi Arabia it's been shown that if you potentially step out of line or express an opinion that doesn't dovetail with leadership, there could be pretty severe consequences. We've seen a number of people being jailed for lengthy sentences over the last couple of years. Having said that, I think within Saudi Arabia, the deal is being pitched as consistent with this sort of Saudi first nationalist approach that Mohammed bin Salman is taking, that he's putting Saudi interests first. He's reaching agreement to put Saudi interests in the region and with China at the forefront of this new phase of development. He's not necessarily wedded to relationships that were forged under his father and uncles that have guided Saudi policy, but he is taking Saudi Arabia into the future, next 50 years, where obviously China is going to be a major player. And so I think a lot of the context for how this agreement is being portrayed is within that framework. And then across the Gulf, I think there's been such a shift towards, as others have said, a spirit of rapprochement and reconciliation. I think everyone was perhaps exhausted by the decade that followed 2011, the sort of constant rifts and a lot of the bitter infighting, especially during the Qatar blockade crisis, was so straining. I think there's a lot of people, I think, are just very keen to just put it behind and to sort of move on to some extent. And so, again, that taps into a wider feeling that was underway even before the 10th of March agreement was signed.
Great. We have a related question here about how could this deal impact MBS's vision of 2030. It might be useful for our television viewers, as they say in the business, to sort of say something about what that vision is. And Danya, too, you might want to contribute here. You know, what? Excuse the cat. It's not a Persian cat, by the way. I want to make that clear. Very vocal animal. What does it entail? How does, what kinds of trade-offs does the 2030 vision mean in practical terms for the economy of Saudi Arabia? How does the agreement with China affect that? And I think that's sort of one set of questions. And how will it affect and a related question we have here is how will it affect all the talk of possible reconciliation between or the renewal of, or not the renewal, but the creation of relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Now, the two countries have what I call implicit normalization. I've written about that, but how does that affect that dynamic? And of course, the Israelis have sort of viewed this whole process as potentially affecting or undermining the whole Abraham Accord. So there's a bunch of issues, but let's start with the question of what this 2030 project means and how the China-Saudi sort of relationship fits into that. Christian, you want to elaborate then, and Danya maybe can take it from there.
Okay, sure. Well, Vision 2030 began life as a program to transform Saudi Arabia's economy, to try to build a bridge away from over-reliance on oil and gas. Mohammed bin Salman famously said in 2016 that I think by 2020 we can live without oil. But actually, now he's in the opposite position. He needs oil prices to remain at a higher level to bring in the revenues and to fund all the projects, in part because there hasn't been much foreign investment into Saudi Arabia, into any of the big projects he's earmarked. And in part, I think that has been related to issues of political risk, regional risk, There's obviously the fallout from the Ritz-Carlton arrests in 2017, from some of his missteps vis-a-vis Jamal Khashoggi and others, but also a sense that the region was also, when Saudi Arabia was coming under attack for missiles and drones, it wasn't seen as something that was necessarily conducive to a long-term investment. So I think he needs revenues now to remain high to implement these major projects, NEOM, the Red Sea, Qiddiya Entertainment Park, that have become identified so closely with what he's trying to do. And we've seen him trying to focus on travel, entertainment, tourism, hospitality, announcing a new airline, the massive expansion of the airport. Now, these are all economic sectors, not only where the UAE has a 25-year head start, but if he's going to get them to succeed, he needs confidence in Saudi Arabian stability. And so that obviously plays into the next 7 years and this dynamic and this impulse to diffuse the points of tension that could derail that. It's all about de-risking the situation so he can move on with trying to push these into implementation. Because until now, we've seen very kind of computer-generated images, but actual sort of physical infrastructure is still being built. And so that's what he needs to focus on.
Great, thank you. Danya, any remarks on, talking about the regional architecture, and we've only mentioned Abraham Accords. So from the perspective, I mean, this was quite a dramatic a shift in the region, particularly when we think about the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain as well, but also to some extent Saudi Arabia and obviously Israel. What does this mean for that particular sort of structure, which of course was promoted by Trump, but also very much facilitated by the Biden administration? They're heavily invested, at least rhetorically, and I suppose militarily, given everything that's going on in terms of cooperation militarily above or behind the scenes in the region between Israel and several Gulf countries. How does this all play out now that Iran and Saudi Arabia are reconciling, and perhaps the two are just parallel sort of tracks that don't affect one another? So your insights would be appreciated. Your mic's not on.
I'm muted, sorry. I believe that Saudi has kind of have this new perspective as Saudi first, right? It's kind of like Trump, America first. I do think that just because they have reproached or established diplomatic relations, actually is more proper, with Iran, doesn't mean that Saudi Arabia wouldn't pursue its interests with Israel. Now, given that, what is Saudi Arabia's interest with Israel at this point? I don't think Saudi Arabia has the appetite to normalize with Israel even before this deal. And so I think it's too costly right now. And the current King Salman, is completely against it. Now, we don't know if Mohammed bin Salman becomes king, could things change? But I think even the appetite among the citizens across the region have made it very clear that they don't welcome the idea. And Saudi Arabia has a different role, as many of you are aware, than the other GCC states or UAE. It is the custodian of holy sites for the Muslim world. So it has to consider all of these factors before normalizing with Israel. Could it adversly affect possible normalization, if even that's a stretch, that's even an option? Maybe it changes Saudi's calculus, not seeing Iran as a full-blown threat, but I still think that Saudi Arabia sees Iran as a threat. So I don't think Saudi Arabia will do anything to go into Iran's corner if that's what people are or analysts or experts or pundits have been saying, that, oh, okay, now Saudi's in Iran's corner. No, I think that certainly the tensions are still there. We still haven't seen the results of the deal and haven't seen really if both sides are going to stick to their agreements on this deal. And so I think it's too preliminary to say, but I generally don't think that normalization is going to happen.
Right. Well, I would agree with that. Imad, you want to add anything to this particular discussion? Because we have others, but these, I want to package these around.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Dan. I agree with what Dania has said. I don't think Saudi Arabia is rushing to normalize with Israel. If for no other reason, it's because the UAE is so much into the normalization issue. So Saudi Arabia would want to be a little different from what Abu Dhabi is thinking. Saudi Arabia does not want to be the one who followed the UAE into normalizing. At the same time, I mean, like Daniel said, there is a lot riding on Saudi Arabia's leadership of the Arab world and the Islamic world and the Muslim world. So, this is really a very, very heavy kind of situation. But I wanted to just allude to the issue of publicly speaking in the Arab world. The agreement was well received. Everybody thought that it's really a very great coup, and everybody thinks that it is going to have very, very positive results on Yemen and Syria and Iraq and Lebanon. And the issue is, how do the states, how do the governments deal with this? That's a different story. But I think they will wait to see how the next couple of months, 2-3 months, really shape up. By the way, I also I'm sorry, I do want to plug another paper by Christian last week on this. So everybody, please look up Christian Ulrichsen's article on the organization, on the agreement and its impact on the GCC states on our website. Thanks, Dan.
We've already touched this discussion already in the last few minutes on quite a number of the questions that have come through, and we want to emphasize we are certainly encouraging folks to send in more questions. I do want to circle back, and maybe Barbara, you want to jump on this, to the elephant in the room, which is sort of where, and also Dina as well. First of all, now that with the JCPOA pretty much out of the picture, although we still see interesting signals from the Iranians occasionally that if they can resuscitate it, under certain conditions they would. But the Iranian positions have been pretty firm and pretty difficult to negotiate, right? When they demand an immediate unilateral ceasing of sanctions, a position, by the way, that the Chinese have supported, that's really a no-go in terms of the ability of the Biden administration to respond for reasons both strategic and domestic, right? But now we have the continued standoff between the International Atomic Agency and Iran, which for a while we thought, well, maybe there was an opening to sort of resolve it, and there were talks in that regard, and this is just a few weeks ago, right? And yet the reports, which seem pretty convincing of what Iran has achieved in terms of its enrichment, are quite extraordinary. And what Iran started out as a kind of, the experts will tell us that Iran's enrichment program was directed as a form of leverage, right? In the context of trying to renegotiate or resuscitate or whatever the JCPOA, and that by increasing enrichment, they were increasing their leverage and signaling the West and so on. But now they've reached a point where the perception of the enrichment program, maybe in Iran, but certainly abroad, is that it's no longer about leverage. And that once you get up to 85, 88% enrichment, well, by God, what's the next step? Let's experiment with elements of weaponization. We know that weaponization is a big word, covers a lot of issues. It doesn't happen overnight and involves a lot of steps, not least of which is testing. And the Israelis are not going to sit there and watch this evolve and just not react, right? Particularly if it looks serious, and the Israelis see it as serious. And I mentioned in the paper that I wrote for the Arab Center that when Grossi said, when he was visiting, I believe it was Tehran, he said, we reject the use of force, it's illegal. And the Israeli, Bibi said, well, excuse me, this is, we do not accept this statement. And the Israelis don't perhaps have the means to unilaterally attack Iran and do permanent damage to its nuclear capacity, but nevertheless, it's a potentially volatile situation. So could you talk, Barbara, a little bit, anybody else can jump into this, Dina as well, about a sort of where this stands, and does the China-Iran Saudi thing just go on without having any impact? Does China step up? I mean, this is not a situation that the regional actors are going to ignore. And we just had the recent dust up in eastern Syria, and that was pretty significant, right? And Biden, got in there, and so any miscalculation, could suddenly turn a local dust up into something much bigger, right? Even if the parties don't necessarily want it. So, what happens with all this? What will the Biden administration do? How does it view the China role at all relevant? Will China use its leverage to press the Iranians? Will they perhaps establish themselves or try to sell themselves as a mediator, which that would be interesting. So any comments on this? The elephant still sitting in the room. Let's start with Barbara on this.
All right. Well, thank you. Easy questions.
Sure. Yeah, simple.
A couple of thoughts. First of all, the Chinese have not been active players in efforts to revive the JCPOA any more than they were active in negotiating the JCPOA to begin with. We had an event a couple of weeks ago at the Stimson Center, and Kelsey Davenport of the Arms Control Association, I asked her whether China might now, step in and try to do something useful on the nuclear front. And she said, look, if they were going to do something, they would have done it a long time ago. So I would not count on the Chinese reviving the JCPOA. I think the JCPOA is dead. And we're in a situation now where there are efforts to patch together something else that might stabilize the situation and prevent the kind of dire situation that you described. One good factor, I think, is that given this emphasis on regional de-escalation and so on, for the Iranians now to do something really provocative on the nuclear front would clearly upset its effort to reconcile with the Saudis. And as Dina pointed out, I mean, the Iranians want to tamp down the tension for a while. I will point out there was a brief bump in the value of the Iranian currency after the agreement was announced. The reconciliation agreement with the Saudis, but that has already disappeared, and the rial is once again, sinking like a stone. So if the Iranians were to do something really provocative on the nuclear front, I mean, the currency, the bottom would completely fall out of it. And already inflation is at 60%, I think I saw recently. So it's in Iran's interest to sort of tamp this down. If we want to be hopeful, we could see a release of American hostages, 3 dual nationals. There are very advanced negotiations underway to try to get these people freed that involves some unfreezing of Iranian assets to be spent on humanitarian goods. There was a hope this would happen before the Persian New Year. It didn't, but there are still talks underway. And then the next step would be some sort of gesture for gesture, freezing the Iranian program, rolling it back a little bit in return for some other concessions on the sanctions front. You mentioned Iran enriching to 84%. They did, but they didn't accumulate any uranium at that level. The concern is about a large quantity of uranium enriched to 60% and another large quantity enriched to 20%. Taken together, Iran could make 4 nuclear weapons out of this stuff in fairly short order. So that's a concern. The other concern is monitoring by the IAEA. Can you increase transparency? There were some promises made. They haven't followed through. They haven't reinstalled or turned on cameras, but they have, I believe, increased the number of visits to an underground site called Fordo. So some limited steps, but if they increase transparency, that would also go a long way to calming folks down at least a little bit. the last thing the Biden administration or anybody wants is a nuclear crisis with Iran when we've got all this other stuff going on with Ukraine and so forth. It's not in anyone's interest. So hopefully we will not have a full-blown crisis there. What we have in Syria is a continuation, frankly, of this so-called shadow war that's been going on between Israel and Iran and the US sometimes, for years. And it doesn't get attention unless an American is killed, and an American contractor was killed recently.
Thanks. It's you said enough in Richard Random for 4. I read 3. That's quite a development in and of itself, only because if you have enough for 1, that doesn't really give you much of a potential for a program. You need much more robust production in order to have anything that looks like a serious nuclear program that gives them what the experts call second strike capacity. So that's of course why the Israelis follow very closely how much is being produced and how much can be weaponized. And so, yeah, I think I think all the key players have no interest in letting the region sort of fall into or escalate into war, and that's Israel as well. But nevertheless, it's quite a development. Do you want to say anything, Dina, about sort of where, particularly I'm wondering about sort of, because for the Iranians, given the economic situation, and there's a big debate in Iran, but also here in the Iranian expat community in the United States about sort of where sanctions should go and what sanctions do and how effective and all the rest of it. But clearly the Iranian economic situation, which Barbara just described, is not unrelated to the sanctions issue, and the Iranians would benefit, and that's where the IAE and a kind of less for less agreement comes in, because what some of the ideas were for sort of limited release of sanctions and so on, and that was floated in the last few weeks or months, and that suddenly sort of seemed to not be working out. But the Iranians certainly would welcome this, some sort of relief on sanctions. So what's going on in Iran in terms of, and that may or may not have any bearing on the China question, as as was said, they were not involved in the JCPOA, although the Chinese keep saying we can play a constructive role now with the International Atomic Energy Committee. So is that in any way, are these things in any way tied in your view?
Just quickly to follow up on what Barbara was saying, I completely agree with everything that she outlined. I would just highlight, though, that sitting in the West, we have a tendency to focus really on the nuclear issue, and with good reason. But I think when you're sitting in the region, obviously Israel notwithstanding, it's a really different picture. And I think from China's perspective, it's a different picture as well. I think countries in the region, their focus is on what Iran is doing conventionally in the region. They've suffered from that for the last 30, 40 years. And they feel the brunt of that on a daily basis. They don't really feel the brunt of a potentially nuclear Iran at the moment. What they feel is, the threat of Iranian missiles, the threat of Iranian proxies. And I think that's what the region is trying to address with this new kind of two-pronged approach to dealing with Iran, of containment on the one hand, which they've always tried to do, but they've now supplemented that with a measure of engagement of Iran, which is a perfectly logical policy for what they're trying to achieve, I think. So really, their focus is much less the nuclear issue, much more what's happening in the region. And I think you could probably say the same for a country like China, who's getting involved in brokering these deals. On sanctions, look, nobody will sit here and argue and say sanctions has had no impact on Iran. Of course, they've had a significant impact on Iran. It's also important to highlight that the Iranian government itself did a wonderful job of ruining the Iranian economy and mismanaging it, even without Western unilateral and multilateral sanctions. So sanctions made it worse, for sure, but they did not. They weren't the cause. Put it that way. They weren't the only cause of the current economic situation in Iran. I am a big believer in this idea of adding on successive rounds of sanctions I don't think is getting us anywhere. Iran has been sanctioned for the last 40 years. And as far as I can see, and I'd love to be proved wrong, it hasn't changed Iranian behavior in any way at all. The only times Iran's behavior changed was when it was in Iran's interest to change its behavior. And it was often when, you had a carrot or something that was thrown in along with a little bit of pressure that changed Iranian behavior. Otherwise, it hasn't been successful. So this idea of increasing sanctions on Iran, this idea that's very prominent amongst the Iranian diaspora and opposition outside the country, very prominent, to squeeze Iran, isolate Iran, sanction it further, and that will help the movement. That really makes my head explode. I don't see how that helps the movement. You've already sanctioned Iran up to here. Like I said, it hasn't changed Iranian behavior. All it's done is it's made the Iranian people suffer. It's making it harder for them to access medicine and food. And I'm not quite sure how further cutting off their access to these things is going to make the movement any more successful than it has been over the last 6 months. The other thing to add is that also it's well known that sanctions end up benefiting those that are the strongest in a country. And so if you're trying to target the Revolutionary Guards in Iran through targeted sanctions, it doesn't work really well, because you end up targeting small and medium-sized businesses that go out of business because they can't afford to do business in an environment where sanctions raise the cost of staying in business and functioning. Well, who's going to swoop in and fill the void? The organization that's the strongest and the richest and the best placed, which is the Revolutionary Guard. So you end up doing this counterproductive thing of actually reinforcing the actor that you're trying to take down. So as you can tell, I'm not a big supporter of sanctions.
Yeah, I happen to agree with everything you just said and have said.
Dan, can I just?
Yes, Iman, please.
I'm
I was
sorry.
going to turn you right away anyway. Go ahead, Iman.
I just want to chime in on one little thing. Actually, it's not too little, but regarding the nuclear program, it's really very, very interesting to talk about it without emphasizing the fact that Iran may want to look very, very strong with the nuclear program because it has a change of leadership. In other words, with Khamenei departing the scene, a new person coming in, they would want a new person to come in strong and have a whole bunch of files to work with. So it's yes, it's good to work on a deal with Iran, but sometimes it's good to ask the question: does Iran want to work on the deal? Does Iran want to limit what it has, what it thinks is a good pressure point for everybody? I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, no, and I agree with that. And as I was saying before, now they've come so far, at this particular moment. I do wonder, by the way, whether, I mean, for the sanctions, what relief on sanctions would do would make it once again easier for the Iranian government to avoid making any real decisions on the economy at all, because the heart of the problem is the way the economy is managed, and fuel sales subsidize inefficiency. So that might be useful for the Iranians, but they are getting a measure of leverage from sustaining their present position. Barbara, you have one finger up there.
One finger, and that is that until Iran has the rule of law, it's not going to be able to attract the kind of investment.
Right.
And I would say the same, frankly, about Saudi Arabia, that without reliable enforcement of commercial laws and without assurances that you're not going to be sentenced to 35 years in prison for a tweet or seized as a hostage, it's very difficult to attract the kind of investment that you want, whether it's from your own diaspora or from foreign actors.
What's happening in Israel today?
That's the root. Sanctions is just, but that is the root.
Yeah, what's happening in Israel today is specifically to that point, right? They want to subvert the judicial process, so investors are gonna run away.
Right, absolutely. We're almost finished here. Anybody want to add any, Danya? Anybody else? Any final remarks before we
Yeah, can I
Robert,
just,
go ahead.
I want to ask our Saudi experts, do you think there's a danger that Saudi Arabia would sell oil to China for and take UN in return? Because I mean, that would be an absolute dagger in the heart of the United States. I mean, forget, OPEC plus. I've been reading between nervousness about this UN, and I'm just curious.
I really don't think that the Saudis are going to plunge that way. I think that would be a shot across the bow, and hey, we are pulling our ambassador from Washington, basically, kind of thing. China has been trying to market its yuan for a long time, and no buyers. And for the Saudis to come and do this, no. I really doubt that they would go that far.
The real is pegged to the dollar, so I think make a move to weaken the dollar kind of weakens the real. I don't know, so I think they would think twice before that, but it has been used as a threat, and I know that there has been concerns about it. I don't foresee that in near term at all.
I'll just pick up on exactly what Dania just said. It's in Saudi's interest maybe to float it as an idea from time to time to keep people guessing, to have it hanging over you as a potential. If you don't play ball, we'll do this. But I'd be like Imad, I'd be very surprised. But certainly as a sort of thing to have out there as an option, should we not like something you may do. That's where its value lies.
Okay, my cat is reminding me that it's time now that we close this very interesting conversation down. So I want to thank all our guests. Of course, it will be up on the big board at the Arab Center for folks to watch later on as well. So thanks very much for joining us, and let's stay tuned to see what happens. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.